Time you walk down your main street, you see job vacancies on the front door of cafes, restaurants, bottle shops, help wanted. It's not just the hospitality that's screaming, industry that's screaming for staff. Agriculture, that industry's short-staffed. Health, ageing, teaching, it's a long list. Last week's budget made some effort to fix worker shortages, but did it go far enough? Well, Melanie McFarland is an immigration consultant and the executive director of the International Students Education Agents Association. And she's with me this morning. Melanie McFarland, good morning.
Good morning, Phil.
Melanie, you've said we need to remove the need for temporary entrant students to prove they will return home after their studies, and instead we should encourage them to remain and join our workforce. So can you tell us how all that might work?
Absolutely, Phil. Yes, I mean, what you were saying was absolutely correct about the shortages. 500,000 people left in the last 2 years, and there's 500,000 vacancies. And international students have full-time work rights at the moment just until June next year. So that does help to solve some of the crisis at the moment. But the problem is that we aren't getting students in the door fast enough. The borders opened in February, but we have seen actually a high number of refusals for student visas and not as many coming in as we would like. And with kind of cut and paste decisions, because what's happening is that there's this requirement within the law at the moment that means that students have to prove that they're going to return to their home country after they finish their studies, which is a bit crazy when you think about how useful, how amazing they have been during the pandemic and now as well. And we're starting to see some of those skill shortages helped by students, for example, in hospitality. So it's something that's really fundamental that the government needs to look at removing, because it allows for these subjective type, also cut and paste decisions, and we just don't get enough of these temporary entrants into the country to then be able to take up that increase in the permanent residence places.
Right. Has there been feedback from, I just listed about 8 different industries and they'd all be nodding their head agreeing with you, which is,
Yes.
Has there been feedback to the government and do they seem to be working on that? Because 500,000 jobs, that's a lot.
It is, isn't it? It's an enormous amount. And as you rightly said, in some of those industries like agriculture, the government actually took away the proposed agriculture visa. And so I'm not certain what's going to take its place. In healthcare, there's been a lot of advocacy to the government, for example, in the aged care area, because back in December 2019, there were 3 care occupations that were supposed to go onto the list of occupations where they can be people can be sponsored to work in that industry, but they never went on because COVID took place in March 2020. So obviously priorities changed. Nonetheless, the government now has the opportunity, and I know that the government has talked a lot about having permanent residents, not having too many guest workers and temporary entrants. But the reality is you can't bring everybody from overseas. It makes more sense to bring in temporary workers also in these areas that are crying out for the workers, and then be able to have those workers, assimilate into the country, they're paying their taxes and so on, settling in, and then they can apply for their permanent residence. And that includes the students too, because a lot of them study in those areas, such as aged care, and that's where we're seeing refusals, for example, starting to come in. So they study in those areas, but then the embassy overseas is saying, well, you can't come in and study that because we think that that's not right and you're not going to go home afterwards. But if they study here, they work in the sector, what's the problem with them staying, actually?
Melanie McFarland, you said the reality. Another unfortunate but harsh reality is a lack of housing. So I'm wondering, with a rental shortage already and an increased influx, would that not exacerbate the problem of a rental shortage?
Yes, that's a very valid point, Phil, and I totally appreciate that. What happens is that with international students, for example, there's actually a lot of student accommodation that has already been set up to welcome in students, so that they're in a kind of a smaller space there, and they're together. These are students from lots of different countries, so it's great. They're all practicing their English together. So a lot of the housing has already been taken care of, and a lot of those places that house housing was sat vacant during COVID. So in terms of that housing, they have plenty of places to stay in that regard throughout their studies. And then, I think the housing crisis is something that clearly the government needs to look at in general. But if we're bringing back students now, they would already have those temporary places to live in for the next few years. And then if they then go on to remain here or stay on further temporary visas, I would hope that we'd have a little bit more sorted out by that stage and perhaps get out of the recession or what have you that we may be going into at the moment.
Hey, you mentioned, was it next June where these visas would expire? If that's all left as per planned at the moment, what happens then? A huge cliff, another huge shortage?
Well, yes, you're right. So the work rights, the full-time work rights will expire next June. What will happen then is students will then go back to what they had previously, which is 20 hours, 40 hours per fortnight, or essentially 20 hours or so per week, where they can work part-time. Again, there is also advocacy in the international education sector to look at least moving that to part-time hours, such as even 24 hours per week, which would allow them to work 3 days per week in a part-time role. At the moment, 20 hours per week, it doesn't afford that. So I think that's something that the government could look at also.
Hey, the budget attempted to reverse the trend of allowing older, richer investors to jump that queue from overseas into Australia and instead tried to put the focus on young, skilled workers. Are you saying that's not enough at this point?
I'm just saying that, I appreciate the gesture, and the increase in permanent resident places is wonderful, because I think that will help us to get towards the net migration targets over the next few years to help aid the ageing population and the workforce. But yes, I think the issue is that there's still not enough focus on the temporary residents. They've got to clear the backlog because there's been money put into that, but frankly, it's not enough. I'll be honest. There's not enough. We've still got huge visa backlogs. We're not getting the temporary workers, and that includes the students and the working holiday makers in time. And that really needs to be focused on, because that is the short-term planning that needs to be looked at.
Melanie, finally, as I mentioned earlier, 7 or 8 different industries all nodding, listening along, thinking, yep, we need that. Any plans to talk to immigration ministers and things like that to see if you can alter this?
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, from the point of view of ICEA, the Organisation for International Student Education Agents, yes, we are pushing as much as possible to government, and also there's various other bodies, the Migration Institute of Australia, and we're constantly speaking and voicing to government our concerns as much as possible. And thanks to yourself, Phil, here I am talking about it on ABC Queensland. So I'm, really pleased to have this opportunity.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and we'll certainly watch this space, that's for sure. I appreciate your insights this morning. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks a lot.
No worries. That's Melanie McFarlane, immigration consultant and executive director of the International Students Education Agents Association.